Hi, everyone, and welcome to this podcast, Our Beloved Church. For those of you who are joining us for the very first time, this is a pretty brand new podcast. We started just a few weeks ago, and one of the reasons that we started was that we felt that there needed to be a place to talk about current events, Bible prophecy, and this type of thing. But from a perspective, especially of how to view these things in such a way that our faith in God is strengthened, and how to strengthen the faith of people who are interested in knowing how to be ready for Jesus' soon return. So one of the things that I've been interested in is what is happening with this New World Order. And the more that I've been looking into it, it's really interesting that this New World Order that everybody is so concerned about and everybody is so confused about, that the Bible says that there is nothing new under the sun. That we can see from government structures in the past what Satan's intentions are, how he's going to work. And the Bible also says that God's word is a lamp unto our feet and a light unto our path. We believe that as we look at current events through the lens of Bible, prophecy, and biblical principle, that God's people can know what to expect in the future and how to be ready for Jesus' soon return. We don't have to be confused and fall off the path. And so today we're going to be talking about something that happened in history, recent history, and something that maybe people don't understand to be related to what is happening today, and that is World War I, Woodrow Wilson, the 14 Points of Peace. To talk about that is this panel of people that we've invited. Natalie Furman, I think you're all familiar with her, Dr. Tim Rumsey, Davy Garcia, and Grace McIntosh. And so I'm just going to have them introduce themselves to you briefly. We'll start out with Natalie, then we'll go to Dr. Tim, Davy, and then Grace in that order. You're muted, Natalie, everybody.
Hi, everyone. I'm Natalie Furman, and I'm just going to introduce myself as someone who likes to geek out about history and to notice patterns in history and how they apply to our everyday world that we live in. And then I like to share some of my research.
My name's Tim Rumsey, and it's a pleasure to be here as part of this discussion today. Unlike Natalie, I'd never really cared much about history until I started studying it in relation to Bible prophecy, and seeing how the Bible, both in history and today and in the future with prophecy, connects with the real world has been very fascinating for me. So I do a lot of Bible prophecy seminars, and I think that as we go through our discussion today, we'll certainly find connections with Bible prophecy.
Welcome. Oh, sorry, Davy.
No problem. My name's Davy. I host the show sometimes. I'm a friend of Joyce and Natalie, and I've always had an interest in history. I think World War I is very fascinating, and my fascination with history was part of what got me interested in the Bible in a secular way, and then that ended up in a spiritual way, as it really does if you're earnestly studying the Bible. And I'm also an elder in my church, and I've been a baptized Adventist for 3 years now.
Yes, and I've met Davy before, and Natalie and Joyce, but I haven't met Pastor Tim Rumsey. It's a pleasure to meet with you, and welcome to the viewers. Matthew 25:13 says, "Watch, therefore, for you know neither the day nor the hour wherein the Son of Man comes." That's basically saying you don't have the calendar, so you have to watch what the signs are because you're supposed to be ready. So hopefully this is sort of the watchman on the wall. So we're one little person can't do it all. one little person can't have all the information. Anyway, I am a lawyer in in Canada, practicing international law, I guess, to some degree. And I've practiced constitutional law and human rights law. And that's how I developed an interest in what's happening in society, in the courts, in the legislature, and what's shaping normative values. How is it that these changes that are taking away our freedoms there's no protest, very little protest. Thank you. Very nice.
All right. Well, thank you so much for being here, everybody. And so, with that, why don't we get started with a word of prayer, and Dr. Tim can pray for us, and then Natalie can get started.
Sure. Our Heavenly Father, we thank you for the opportunity to discuss these very important issues and to also see the connections that they have with the Bible. We thank you for the technology that makes this kind of conversation possible. And we ask, as the Bible tells us we should, for your Holy Spirit's leading as we discuss these things. We pray in the name of Jesus. Amen.
Okay, Natalie, why don't you get started then? Thank you.
Before I get started, I was just thinking, Davey, would you summarize or give us a quick little synopsis of how and what happened for, well, I guess some events around World War I?
Well, World War One is it's a really weird war, and it's a really consequential war. I think it was actually a lot more consequential than World War Two because the world was a really different place before World War One happened. You had these really powerful, proud, honor-based warrior cultures in Europe that developed into these massive empires. And really what caused World War One was just there was so much tension in Europe. There was so much tension in Europe. And you can see that because World War One actually almost happened several times. It almost happened over Morocco. It almost happened over a dispute in the Congo, like of all places. And so World War One almost happened several times until it finally did. And I think that World War One is a very overwhelming topic for a lot of people because there's this weird network of alliances that people don't understand. It started off with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and Americans are like, "What's an Archduke? I don't even know what that is." And so there's a lot of mystique to World War One, and I think it kind of gets overshadowed by World War Two. But really, World War One, a lot of historians kind of look at it. People look at it differently, but a lot of people look at World War One as a war where everyone was a good guy, and World War Two where everyone was a bad guy because like even like the most brutal regimes in World War One, there was no genocides or anything like really intense like that. Where on World War Two, like even the quote unquote best guys, like the best faction, a lot of people would say is the Americans, we still firebombed people and nuked, a country and introduced nuclear weapons. And so like and that's like the quote unquote best country in World War Two. So World War One, there was just, in fact, there was people were actually really excited when World War One happened, whenever it happened, because Europe was full of young men. It was full of young men. They were rich. Everyone was wealthy. Everyone was rich, and there was a lot of young men. There was a very youthful population in Europe at the time. And whenever World War One started, there was actually a month of partying because all these young men thought like, well, we're going to be like knights, like charging out, and it's going to be awesome. It's like an adventure, and we're going to be fighting for Germany or Britain or France or whatever their country was, because back then people weren't all nihilistic and depressed like they are now. Like if you look around you, like all young people are just battered and depressed and spiritually dead, and no one cares about their country or their nation or their people or themselves or anything. there's just kind of this malaise that's kind of settled over our culture. It wasn't like that back then. People actually had this kind of heroic masculine spirit. And in general, the culture was it was hyper masculine. It was like this hyper masculine, honor bound, heroic type of culture. And they built a giant empires that ruled the entire world. The entire world was dominated by Europe at this time, completely. All of the world, almost all the world was either a European colony or was so influenced by Europe, they might as well have been a European colony. Like China wasn't a colony, but it might as well have been because it was so influenced by European powers at the time. And you had this situation where Germany had just formed. They had just formed into an empire, mostly because of Otto von Bismarck, who's one of the greatest leaders of all time. He's this really legendary leader. But you have this new German empire that had just formed, and they felt kind of slighted because they didn't have all these colonial holdings that France did and Britain had and all these other countries had, and even Spain had up until, very recently when they lost everything. So they weren't a big factor. But Germany was by far the most powerful country at this time. They had the most powerful military. They had a lot of the innovations in the world were happening in Europe. It was a place where there was a lot of science and culture and innovation and military prowess. And they felt slighted that they didn't have a lot of colonial holdings that a lot of these other countries had. And everyone was kind of in this weird place to where everyone thought this is our last shot to be like the world hegemon and set the new order for the world. Everyone kind of thought this. France was like, this is our last shot. Germany's like, this is our last shot. Britain's like, this is our last shot. All these European powers that have been building over the last 1,000 years have reached this zenith of their power. They're rich. The Industrial Revolution has just happened. So now they're mechanized. A lot of these countries are industrialized or becoming industrialized rapidly. And they're all thinking this is our window. Like all the last 1,000 years of fighting and, marrying princesses to kings and all this stuff that's been happening over the past 1,000 years. It's all leading up to this. This is our last shot to become the world hegemon. So everyone was thinking this at this time. And so that was kind of what was in the air. And it was this really kind of tragic war where if it would have happened 5 years earlier or 5 years later, it would have been far less brutal than it was because it happened in this time where the defense had such a profound advantage, which is why you had this trench warfare that killed millions of people, which is horrible, probably the most horrible conditions in a war anyone's ever experienced. And because 5 years before that, you didn't have machine guns yet. Machine guns had just been invented, and the offense had not caught up to know how to deal with that. And if it would have happened 5 years later, you would have had tanks, and that would have ended a lot of the carnage, the trench warfare and carnage. So it happened in this sweet spot of time to where Germany had no real way of winning. And despite that, Germany almost entirely won the war. Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, who was the Archduke of Austria-Hungary, because Austria and Hungary were one empire at this time. And it was a really outdated empire. It was like the Ottoman Empire. It was one of these countries that a lot of people don't even know why it existed anymore. And it was hard, it was barely industrialized. And their Archduke was assassinated by this terrorist group in Bosnia through this really unlikely set of circumstances where a bomb went off in front of his motorcade and then they kept going anyway. It's like, oh, a bomb went off and almost killed the Archduke. Well, let's keep going with an open top car. And someone else tried to shoot him before and it missed. And the driver had to get lost. The driver literally kept going, and they even stopped at a hospital to visit the wounded. And after all this, and like, oh yeah, and like doing normal PR stuff, and then they get back in the car, and the driver supposedly gets lost and takes a bunch of wrong turns until the Archduke is literally right in front of like a group of assassins, and they finally get the Archduke. It's this really bizarre set of circumstances, like extremely unlikely. There's conspiracy theories around it, as you can imagine. because it's just so bizarre and ridiculous and unlikely, and nothing surrounding it makes sense. But that happened, and Germany felt like, well, Austria is going to get destroyed because Austria declared war. And immediately that's when all the networks started happening, and all the alliance networks came in, and Russia felt like we have to side with Britain and France, because they thought, well, if we don't do that, Germany's going to crush us one day. And so they sided with them, and then Germany sided with Austria, and it was basically the world versus Germany. It was both world wars were kind of the world versus Germany, and that's kind of the environment that World War One took place in.
That was amazing, Davy. Thank you so much for.
Great, great job.
I don't think that Davy even knew that he was going to be asked to give the summary. Did you know that, Davy?
No.
I knew that last week. That I was going to ask you. I'm sorry. I could have given you a heads up.
Oh no, that's fine. That was good.
Okay.
It's very good.
Okay. Well, it's true. There's tons to talk about when it comes to World War One, all of the intrigues and plots, and I hope that we spend more time talking about it. In fact, I think we will. Um, anyway, but today I want to focus on America's part in World War One. And before I get into that, I'm going to give a little context. I want to focus on America's part on World War One because America soon came to dictate a new system of government for the globe, and that had been kind of bubbling under the surface for a little bit of time before World War One, but it certainly World War One provided the fertile ground for that to happen. So before I talk about that, though, I want to talk about how I started researching this topic. Joyce and I have been talking a lot about how our friends and our family are divided on political lines. And it's like we have scripts that we are talking to each other from these scripts. And we can't seem to get anywhere or really communicate. And so I did a little dive on media and how media affects people. But then it turned into something far bigger. And I would like to talk about that today. I'm going to go ahead and share my slides because the reason I'd like to talk about that today is because I think not only is it just affecting our family or our community, but of course we know that the United States is very polarized. This discussion is really not about the United States, though. This is a discussion that's about everybody, but because it originated here, I'm going to talk about it here. But our friend Grace is Canadian, and so I'd like to include her perspective. And we know that we're part of a global community now. So anyway, a little bit about the discussion is when we start talking about politics, just on a superficial basis, we talk about how frustrated we are with each other and how polarized, how our country's really going down, and erosions in liberty are really the fault of someone else, the other party. The state of the failures in our nation are somebody else's fault. And if you're maybe a Christian, you're on one side. If you're a non-Christian, you're on another side. If you're Black or if you're white, you might be on opposite sides. Maybe you're someone who is a Republican or a Democrat or a constitutionalist versus an expansionist. And we'll talk about what that means. Joyce and I had been listening to this political commentator, and she made a really great observation. And this is what I think I'd like to share with you at the start of this conversation and at the end of this conversation, she said this thing that was, in ideological battles, who you start out with may not be the person you end up with. So whatever your perspective is today, we hope that you will consider this information and stand back a little bit and see how it impacts your life. And maybe it may surprise you to come to the realization that the perspective that you hold is very different than when you zoom out and when you find yourself in the context of a bigger conversation, that you may be identifying with a particular group of people, but if you zoom out and look at the bigger picture, you may find yourself in community with others who may surprise you. And I hope that's a case. I hope that's the case for you and for us, as we would like to build community within the human family and not along ideological lines. So the backdrop of World War I. America really was not interested in getting involved in European wars. And as a general principle, they had not been involved in a lot of foreign wars, a lot of European wars. That was largely due to George Washington's farewell address. And there were a couple of other reasons for this as well. But that had been kind of in the historical rearview mirror of America. But coming up as we were approaching the mid 1800s, late 1800s, some new thoughts came in, new political thoughts. One of them was a thought that came from a Senate hopeful candidate named Albert Beveridge. And he expressed this in his Senate hopeful speech for, it was called the March of the Flag. And we'll talk about that. But basically, there were two thoughts that started to collide in American consciousness. One was neutrality, which is we should stay neutral, like George Washington suggested to us. And the other one was we should expand and come into this colonial mindset that everybody else is talking about. All the other nations are super vogue, and we've got to come into that type of thinking. Another factor that was in the background was the House of Morgan. I think everybody's heard of J.P. Morgan. But the House of Morgan had started in England, and it was part English, part American. And the House of Morgan was responsible for mega financing, global level financing. And they had been financing wars. They had financed some portions of the Civil War. They had financed the Boer War, which we'll talk about, and they also came to finance World War I, some of World War I. I believe about $500 million of World War I was financed through them. The House of Morgan was also responsible. They were the purchase acquisitioners for Britain and France for the World War I. So they had interest in getting a return on their financial investment and also making money off of purchasing supplies. They also helped after the war, they helped with post-war reconstruction loans for several countries. Another factor that was in the backdrop was how to get from the Allied powers, Britain and France and others, how are we going to get America involved in wars? Because there was a point that America had expressed neutrality as a population, but the House of Morgan was going to need to recoup funds, and the British and Britain and France were running out of funds and out of supplies, so they needed someone to kick in funding, and naturally everybody's eyes turned to America, and the question was, how are we going to get them sucked into the war? So there was an accident that happened. We'll call it an accident. And Grace, I hope that sometime you and I can have a podcast and discuss historical accidents. But anyway, there was an accident that happened. Backing up, I'd forgotten about this. So the the accidents that had happened to kind of draw America into wars bit by bit. One of them was the Spanish-American War. And I'm not going to go into that a whole lot other than to say America had a ship that was parked in a dock in Cuba. And there was an explosion, and then suddenly America was drawn into the Spanish-American War. Now we know in history, looking back, that several of our elite American politicians knew that this explosion was going to be happening ahead of time. And so they were counting on American response to be outraged and to be drawn into that war. So
And
that
that's a
was,
classic story you hear over and over. The ship that blows up, and oh, it was this person. It happened with what, the Lusitania and the Gulf of
yeah.
Tonkin, and this that happens
Yeah.
over and over.
Yeah, the Lucy.
Yes, exactly. So well, Davey, we should have a podcast about that.
Yeah, oldest trick in the book.
Okay. So that had happened, and the Boer War. I want to talk a little bit about the Boer War. So that was a war that happened between Britain and South Africa, and basically South Africa was a colony of Britain's, and Britain didn't care about them till there was a whole bunch of gold found in a region of South Africa called the Transvaal. And suddenly there was a huge war that came out of that. And JP Morgan helped to finance some of that, I believe, too. So anyway, Grace, you want to talk a little bit about the Lusitania, what happened with that?
Davy, jump in, please. But just in brief, the Lusitania was it was a passenger ship. It was domestic. They weren't involved in the war, and they weren't where they weren't supposed to be in the waters off the European coast. They were close to Great Britain, and they were attacked and sunk. Most of the people died on that ship, and that struck to the hearts of the Americans. Their relatives are on there. These was just a little passenger ship, wasn't a military ship, and it really had a great deal of influence with respect to the Americans. You could have like it was community outrage. Everybody got on the same page and supported the United States entering into World War I. And if Davey, if you have further details, please provide.
It was the world's largest passenger ship. So that one was a really big deal, just because of how big it was. It was a famous cruise ship. It was actually the same design as the Titanic, which is interesting. And Germany really had to kind of thread the needle because they were being antagonized by British and American cruise ships. They would actually send them directly into the line of German U-boats repeatedly because Germany specifically said, we don't want to sink cruise ships. We don't want to sink civilian ships. Any ship that's within this area, this is a war zone. This is a war zone. You're in danger. Don't have cruise ships and passenger ships coming through this sea lane. And in fact, they even gave them optional other sea lanes that they would not attack. But they kept trying to send these cruise ships through the German lines because they wanted one to get hit. They wanted one to get hit because they wanted to justify public outrage. And there were many times where Germany didn't do it and they stopped, just because, just they stopped in the nick of time. But the Lusitania finally the Lusitania did end up getting hit by a German U-boat.
Yep, that's correct. And what was so weird about that was that there were 173 tons of war munitions on the ship, on the Lusitania. So how you imagine that 1,200 plus people are on this ocean liner flying through a war zone in some kind of vacation cruise with 173 tons of war munitions is a crazy idea. The Germans knew
Yeah.
about all of these war munitions, and they had warned the people they'd warned. I think there was a public press, a public notice notifying people, do not get on ships. So I agree. It was definitely something to draw everyone in.
Yeah,
Um,
and real quick, I think over 1,000 people died in the
mhm.
sinking of the ship. So it was like, the way we look at 9/11 or something like that. It was like an event like that. It was like a lot of, a lot of people knew people who were on the ship that died, and it was very fertile to generate outrage from.
Yeah.
And
So,
what I'm finding interesting about all of this is, I'm someone who I didn't know that much about history. And and so when I, started learning about things like 9/11, and that's when I started learning about, conspiracy theories and JFK and that type of thing. Now it seems that the more that I look at history, even as you're talking about World War I and this type of thing, um, so many of these conspiracy type things do seem to pop up quite commonly, huh? It does seem like there's nothing new under the sun, even with what we see with Charlie Kirk and everything that's coming out now that makes us think, wow, what a psyop we seem to be living in. What a Truman Show that it seems to be. It seems like this is something that has been going on from the beginning of time, possibly. So we see these biblical principles being played out very much so that there is nothing new under the sun.
Yeah, it just gets more sophisticated. The technology gets better, the tactics evolve, but the general playbook, and sometimes, it's a straight, Satan just kind of copies his own work and just kind of does the same thing over with the latest culture, the latest technology, the latest whatever the latest tactics are, but really it's the same modus operandi.
Yes. And then it seems that we make up a lot of these stories that go along with it, and then we intellectualize it all, and people who are able to describe these things and come up with theories about these things, we put them on these pedestals and that type of thing. It's just really interesting the way that we have built a whole society based upon these things. Some of them might not actually be true, and many of them may not be true, and yet we have books of history being written about these things. And now that we look at everything from this perspective, it's so difficult to know what to believe about anything. But I'll let you keep on going.
yeah, well, it's really true. All of that stuff is true. And I agree, Davey. The methods are really the same. They just get more sophisticated with time. Um, Another thing that happened that was really key at that time was Britain cut America's the cables. I can't even quite remember how it went. There were cables cut so that Britain could control all information that went to America, but America really didn't have information coming from other places. And that was another accident that happened around that time. So another thing that was popping up was the olden days, I guess the 1800s and earlier. We had our Western civilization was coming out of a very churchy time. And so maybe people weren't really churchy, but there was a church culture in society. But what happened to disturb that was there was the Enlightenment started this idea that, hey, we don't really need God. And so different ideas about, for example, the Darwinian theory of evolution really came to um, bear on societal thought. For example, people started saying, hey, we don't need God in our growth and development. We don't need him in our origin. We have this new idea of Darwinian theory, which is the race survival goes to the fittest. And that really came to the forefront of Western thought in a number of ways. And one of those ways was race theory. And it wasn't just about color, it was also who was the best thinker, who was the most intellectual, who was the most capable of rising to the top. And the idea was whoever was capable of rising to the top, that's who should lead humanity. Um, and and then this idea was forwarded by these guys, which I'll just call the whole group of them the social thinkers. And Grace, you just did a talk on that. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the Darwinian race theory.
The Darwinian race theory was very significant, as you have stated. I just want to say, when you were talking about conspiracy, there is a verse in the Bible. It's in Isaiah chapter 8, and he is talking about a confederacy in those verses. And in verse 9, there's this discussion about associating yourselves, and then gets to verse 12, and it's basically saying, like, don't say like a confederacy in fear, I'm going to take care of you. And then Mrs. White says, through apostasy, fallen men and fallen angels are in the same confederacy, league to work against good, right? They are united in a desperate companionship. And so this whole idea of conspiracy and how it's now a pejorative term was actually fomented by the Department of Defense, which is now the Department of War. And so, Natalie, I think you said that you wanted me to talk about, just say it one more time.
The social scientists, talk a little bit about this movement of the Darwinian. And
okay, so yes. So what's very interesting is that Darwin, he was just received with so much delight, because prior to Darwin, it just seemed like whether you were on the dark side or whatever side you were on, everybody accepted to some degree that there was a higher power, that there was a God. And Darwin came up with this idea that there might not be a God, and because it's all evolution. And it's tied into so many things. And so people were just delighted with that. So Wilhelm Wundt in Leipzig, Germany, was conducting experiments on classical conditioning. He was delighted that this meant that we are the total sum of stimulus and responses. And Pavlov in Russia was delighted that it seemed that there was no God, that we were just the total sum of our reactions to stimulus. And so this was acted upon by the authorities, and is, around the world, in what you would call the Western countries, but especially in Europe, but in North America as well. The government was funding research, as they do now, as they've always done, and they were funding research with respect to the favored races. And that research was a scientific basis for a lot of really unfortunate outcomes, including World War II and Germany accepting Hitler. He fed them this idea that there were favored races, and it wasn't, the Jews were not favored races. They weren't even human, based on the legislative definitions. And so there was no such thing as murdering a Jew. And actually well into the 1960s, there's a legislation in Australia that indicated that the indigenous people there were not human. They were fauna, like they were animals, part of the animal landscape, and that killing, an indigenous person in Australia wasn't murder. So the basis for a lot of racism came out of those government-funded research, the studies and the articles that were published. And unfortunately, many church publications, including our own, published articles that, the favored races are in danger, and this is based on scientific studies and so on. And so Darwin's long title to his book was about that favored races, and people forget that. They forget that. If one of you gentlemen wants to jump in, and if you remember the name of that, the long title of his book, I would be, yeah.
No,
Right here.
I'm not sure about the title, but I do know that at that time, yeah, genetics and eugenics were super popular, even among whites. Like it wasn't even like the white race is superior, though there was some of that. But the Germans felt they were even superior to like the Russians. And especially during World War I, they were killing 3 Russians to a man. And the Russians would send an army of like 1 million men at Germany, and Germany would just mow them down. And doing that over and over again is kind of what ruined the Russian Empire, caused their whole empire to collapse and devolve into the communist revolution. And Germany was like, well, see, like, look, like we're clearly the better ones. We're clearly the superior people, even though Germans and Russians are actually quite genetically similar, especially today. But they used a lot of their feats that they have had achieved, because Europe really did achieve some monumental, incredible things over the past 500 years. It was pretty incredible what Europe did, and especially in the Victorian age. Like the Victorian age was just just innovation after innovation after discovery after there was so much incredible innovation and in literature and culture and art and science and math and everything, that it created a real fertile ground for people to accept these ideas that they were genetically superior.
Yes. And I did find the title of the book. So everything that Davy said. And so there were these studies that were being funded by the government, and then the universities were carrying out the studies that were scientific with respect to favored races. And the long title of Darwin's book that nobody seems to care about is On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, comma, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. And that was published in 1859. And then you just settle into this idea that foments and turns into the basis for annihilating, a whole race. The final solution, as the Germans Hitler called it.
Yeah, and you see a lot of that coming back today as well. Because when people look at the state of the world, they say like, well, look at our countries, like look at the West, look at the United States, look at Britain, look at France. Multiculturalism has failed. That France is no longer populated by French people, and Britain is no longer populated by British people, and America is no longer populated by Anglo white people. And these are a lot of the reasons for the West problems, is that certain races are the ones committing the crimes, other races are the ones spreading degeneracy and pornography and corrupt art and culture. And that if we could just have a pure society again with favored races, with the dominant races that we had in the past, that things would go back to the way they were in the glory days. And so you kind of see a lot of that coming back.
Yeah.
You really do.
Mhm. I thank you for that summary. Well, these social scientists were pretty involved in America's backdrop, and as we've discussed, there was the eugenics thinking, but then that really came to affect the intellectual thinking and the intellects of America that were holding all the positions, the college presidents, the bankers, the social strata that was at the top started saying to themselves, actually, I don't think they started saying, it just came out into the open. We have the blessing of the latest science from these scientists, and we need to rise to the top and we need to rule. So we'll talk about that in a second. Anyway, in America, for the first 4 years, we were not in the war, but people could see the writing on the wall, and there was an anti-war movement that started springing up and warning everyone in the US, hey, we got to stay out of this war. This is crazy stuff going on. Don't be involved in this. And President Woodrow Wilson kept us out of the war. And for his second term in office, he campaigned on the speech that we would not be entering war, or he had kept us out of the war, so we should all vote for him again. And so that's what America did. And I'm going to, hang on just a minute, move on here. I'd like to look over briefly, I'd like to talk a little bit about George Washington's speech, because that affects what happens next. So America, as I said, had this mindset that there should be unity of government, as George Washington said, and unity was viewed as the main pillar, or it was the main pillar in the edifice of our real independence in the United States. And how George Washington viewed unity was that we would have a checks and balance system, and that power would be allocated properly and maintained properly. It would be distributed properly. And if there was any kind of amendments that needed to be done, we would go through a public process, and we do that together. He warned us not to seek absolute power in an individual. He said, don't seek power in a faction or a group of people, and avoid centralizing power. Another thing that he warned the US public about was that we should, above all things, be very alert against foreign and insidious influences. He called it a baneful woe. So the idea was to have as little political connection as possible with other countries, and that internal and external enemies that were seeking to divide the United States should be avoided. And there would be this attitude like, hey, I've got something better for you. There's this newfangled political idea I want to sell you. Why don't you lay aside that old system and come take me up on this new offer, which we'll see Woodrow Wilson introduced. George Washington said to the American people, all of the parts combined together are going to make the best form of government. Don't try and piecemeal out this or that. Greater strength and resource will provide security. And the Union will come from staying out of foreign wars. And he went on to explain a little bit about foreign wars. Now, the United States, if you've never read the Federalist Papers, probably to some people who hate historical documents, it might be super boring. But the Federalist Papers talk in part, amongst other things, about how the United States got to be united. And there are really simple explanations as to why it's so important. For example, if we were 50 different nation states or different countries, we'd have to have 50 different armies. If, for example, we were growing agriculture in Alaska or in the Midwest, and Alaska needed some of the agriculture, it would be it may be a cause of war to procure food that they don't have for 6 or 9 months out of the year. If, for example, the Midwest needed supplies from the East or West Coast that were shipped into other countries, a cause of war might be, hey, you didn't give me some of that stuff you bought. Now I've got to fight you to get some of the things I need. So in combining the 50 states, there was a unity and a looking out for each other. And another thing was the United States is or North America in general, was a really big landmass. We're surrounded by oceans on either side. So we're insulated from a lot of stuff that happens overseas. And that was a natural barrier. And part of the Federalist Papers encouraged America to say, hey, look around. There's a natural protection in our environment, and there should be a natural protection by cooperating together. And so George Washington's advice to this young burgeoning nation was, don't be separated by joining up in wars for no reason. Don't get yourselves dividing amongst yourselves for no reason. Another thing he mentioned was avoid overgrown military governments and conduct yourselves in a way so that you're peaceful. Don't always trying to be meddling or peacekeeping in other nations, because then you're not being fair or just to the world around you, and you're going to provoke enemies. Then there was this new guy. I talked already about Albert Beveridge, who was a Senate hopeful. I can't remember if he became a senator or not. But anyway, he gave this speech, which was really just talking about some, I guess, some new ideas that were popping up in the United States with this colonial thinking. Some of his ideas were that we should have commercial supremacy in the world. Basically, hey, other countries have colonies. Why shouldn't we have colonies? Other people are buying British goods, French goods. Why shouldn't we sell? We could really advance ourselves. We're superior to everybody. And look around us. We have this amazing work ethic, and we should expand and rule others. We, as a people, are more virile than everybody else. We have this intellectual knowledge that is more superior than other nations. Darwinian survival of the fittest is granted to the US. And then he did something pretty tricky, which was he invoked this Puritan idea of God has ordained the U.S. to go out and to conquer others. We've been commanded to, therefore we should. And this sounds a little bit like manifest destiny. And then he started talking about this duty to extend liberty to the philosophically oppressed. Those brown people over there, they're being oppressed by those Bolsheviks, or, whatever the case was. And we've got to go and save them and make the world safe for democracy. Basically, was amongst one of the first few times that argument was heard. And then he called the Declaration of Independence preposterous. So then President Wilson, moving on to his speech, and I know some of this is kind of boring and tedious, but I want to get through this so we can then talk about what happened next. President Wilson gave his first campaign speech to become president, and he talked about being a progressive versus a liberal in his campaign speech. Now, being a progressive means you think that government should regulate, protect, and solve your problems. Being a liberal means you're more focused on individual liberties and limited government.
Right, because Wilson was a progressive, right?
He was a progressive, as we will see. So then he started invoking this idea of a Darwinian government model, which is elite government men solve modern problems, and the little population people should just hand over their problems to the government so these elite men could solve the problems for them. And he used evolution as a scientific word to interpret the Constitution according to the Darwinian principle. So basically, he thought the Constitution was an old sound doctrine back for the old days and the old people, but now we've advanced. We're capable of more than that old thinking, and we got to move on to the modern age. Liberalism, or individual government, was viewed as a very antiquated idea. And he had this quote that I'm going to quote a little bit later and show the implications of what he did later. So his quote was that political architects and political engineers should steadily rebuild their house, meaning our political house, until in a generation or two, all this scaffolding will be taken away, and then we'll live in a wonderful and perfect coordinated beehive. We will make the young people as different from their fathers as far as possible. They'll be out of sympathy. They'll be out of touch. And with the old generation, they'll have sympathy for the old generation, but basically they'll be moving on to the new age. And he called the old people sticks in the mud. He said, y'all won't be harmed. You're just lonely. You just need a pat on the head and everything's going to be okay. So in the middle of all of this, though, he says this thing that's really weird in his political speech, which is now a part of his book. He says this thing that is, oh, I don't think it was in his political speech. I'm sorry. I think it's just in his book. He said, since I have entered politics, I have chiefly had men's views confided to me privately. Some of the biggest men in the United States are in the field of commerce and manufacture. They are afraid of someone and of something. They know that there is a power somewhere so organized, so subtle, so watchful, so interlocked, so complete, so pervasive, that they had better not speak above their breath when they speak in condemnation of it. So this is a really weird thing to talk about in the middle of all this architecture work of the new future. But
Yeah, and can you distill some of this? What was it that they were trying to, what was it about the old generation that they wanted to change and give way to the new? What was the new?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about that. So the new is the 14 points, Wilson's 14-point plan for the future, which led to the League of Nations, which led to the United Nations, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So. Okay, so after Wilson got into his second term, all of a sudden, tra-la, there's a war. And the question became, how are we going to sell the war? But the real question, the bigger question was, how are we going to sell this ideology? Because if you start reading all of the books, all of the autobiographies, all of the accounts of how we did this, how we did that, you realize that these men had a plan, they outlined a plan, and then they conducted this plan to move America from the old George Washington model into the new model of the New World Order. So part of this was those social scientists, and that was the study of the popular mind. And Grace, do you want to talk to us a little bit about how this social scientist thinking came, what some of the main points were about that?
So the idea of the popular mind also is the terms like community, sorry, it would be like a community coming together in one idea and getting like popular opinion and influencing the populace to get them to do what you want them to do. And I just want to say that the books that bring it out, that maybe the best books to read, are books by Edward Bernays. So he wrote the book called Propaganda. He is Sigmund Freud's nephew. And he wrote the book Propaganda. It was based on Pavlov's studies. And there was this whole idea in there about an invisible government. And if you had an invisible government, you really could trick the people into having community think. And then he wrote another book, and that book was called Crystallizing Public Opinion. And so it was Darwin, with this idea of the favored races. And then it was experiments that were going on in Germany, experiments that were going on in Russia, that became the basis for this idea of controlling public opinion and community think, and their and the principles of propaganda, and how would they do this. And it's in these books that have not really been I mean, they serve as a basis for other books, but they haven't been improved on, and so to speak. So the overarching principle with this idea of getting this, you talked about the crowd study of the popular mind behavior theories applied to crowd think. So our overarching principle that they developed was this: we first define, and then we we provide the visual. We first define, then see, to the populace to get to control them. So if through the media, the invisible government, as Bernays called it, can condition a certain response from the public, when the reality hits, the invisible government can depend on a conditioned group response. For example, Hollywood plays a significant role, right? The movie Avatar came out in December of 2009. 2 weeks later, in January 2010, it had grossed over $1 billion. Then less than 6 months later, this cap comes off the pipe in the Florida Keys. It's this offshore oil structure, which oddly enough it was 87 days to put the cap back on, to stop the oil from going into the Gulf there. It was almost 3 months. And during that time, the Obama government moved hundreds of millions of dollars into government departments that prior to all of this happening, that moving that money had been blocked politically. And so I just see it as one example of this idea of you define something first, and then when you introduce to the public a stimulus, you will get the conditioned response. And all of a sudden, there was the political will for all these things that the Obama government had been wanting to do through, for example, through urban development, and then through environmental, all of these things that they wanted to do, that there were issues with that, there were danger, there wasn't guardrails put up, and all of a sudden there was political will to do it because they couldn't get the cap on it's beyond me how that happened for 87 days. Anyway, Edward Bernays goes into a little bit of detail about the methods for creating a common consciousness. That's what I was trying to think of, but I had all this common consciousness, I guess and it's this idea, if you could put everybody to sleep at night and give them all the same dream where they would wake up in the morning, most of those people are going to have a similar response to a stimulus. This was the idea. So but there were 3 methods of creating this common consciousness. And the first method was patronage and pork, is what they called it. And it's sort of, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So all of a sudden, everybody's holding hands underneath the table, even though it looks like these, the sugar board and the pork board, don't really have any connected interests. Underneath the table, they're holding hands. So they create these relationships where they're going to help each other, even where it seems like they have no interest. That was number 1. The second one was governance by terror and obedience, and that was used the least in Western countries. And then there was this burgeoning method of control, which they referred to as education by information. So if everybody gets the same information, we'll all be on the same page, they'll understand the government's goals, and they will all be on the same page and vote for how we want them to vote. And this was how, I know you're going to talk about it, Natalie, but there was a committee on public information that came into being in the early 1900s, and it was led by George Creels. And I know that you're going to talk about that, and I just make that as a mention. And currently, this education by information is the most popular method. But these all work to develop a common consciousness. And the common consciousness is very important because it determines how far cooperation of the public will depend on force or the milder alternative of parentage and privilege. So I wonder if anybody realizes that Edward Bernays' family, so in some sense, like connected to Sigmund Freud's family, they actually, their relatives own Netflix. It's my idea that they have finessed the invisible government. And these ideas, that came out of, here's the little book, Crystallizing. You probably can't read it, but it's Crystallizing Public Opinion. I don't know. No, it's not going to work. So these are all based on Pavlov's studies and the studies that came out of Leipzig, Germany. And it was this idea of classical conditioning and how do you do that on a group scale? How do you do that on a global scale where you're getting support, right? And I just want to say, there was another historical author, Alexis de Tocqueville. He wrote Democracy in America, and he wrote it during the 1800s. So it was he wrote it during the 1800s. I'm just going to see exactly when he published it. He lived during the 1800s. He was born in 1805 and he died in 1859. And he wrote this and it was published during his lifetime. I don't have the exact date, but he wrote this. These things are very important for us to hear. Freedom is found at different times in different forms. It's not exclusively dependent on one social state, and one finds it elsewhere than in the democracies, right? So he says, this particular and predominating fact peculiar to those ages is equality of conditions, and the chief passion which stirs men at such times is the love of the same equality. So he is taking like the love of freedom and the love of equality, and he's having a discussion about it over these 2-3 pages. And he says, democratic peoples always like equality, but there are times when their passion for it turns to delirium. So he talks about like the long, worn out struggle for freedom, and people die for freedom. And they say, but he says, but political liberty is easily lost. Neglect to hold it fast, and it is gone. And then he says, the passion for equality seeps into every corner of the human heart, expands and fills the whole. It is no use telling them that by this blind surrender to an exclusive passion, they are compromising their dearest interests. They are deaf. It's no use pointing out that freedom is slipping from their grasp while they look the other way. They're blind or cannot see because they're covetous. And he says, I think democratic peoples have a natural taste for liberty, but they want equality and freedom. But if they cannot have equality in freedom, they still want equality in slavery, and they will put up with poverty, servitude, and barbarism, but they will not endure aristocracy. So he said, the danger is that as you have political freedom and you have freedom that you fought for, you can very easily lose that in this crazed seeking for equality. And in Edward Bernays' book, he talks about the need of the human being to be with a group, and he calls it the gregarious tendency of man. And he makes these 5 points. Man is intolerant and fearful of solitude, physical and mental. And he talks about taking advantage of that. And then he says, number 2, he's more sensitive to the voice of the herd than to any other influence. Okay. And in that discussion, he says, Mr. Trotter illustrates this characteristic in a paragraph worth quoting in its entirety. He says, the voice of the herd can inhibit or stimulate an individual man's thought and conduct. It is the source of his moral codes, of the sanctions of his ethics and philosophy. It can endow him with energy, courage, and endurance, and can easily take these away. It can make him acquiesce in his own punishment and embrace his executioner, submit to poverty, bow to tyranny, and sink without complaint under starvation. Not merely can it make him accept hardship and suffering unresistingly, but it can make him accept as truth the explanation that his perfectly preventable afflictions are sublimely just and gentle. It is this acme of the power of herd suggestion that is perhaps the most absolutely incontestable proof of the profoundly gregarious nature of man. And he goes on to identify two other, man is subject to the passions of the pack in his mob violence and the passions of the herd in his fear and his panics. He says he is reasonably susceptible to leadership, and he is often satisfied by leadership of a quality which cannot stand analysis and which must therefore satisfy some impulse rather than the demands of reason. His relations with his fellows are dependent upon the recognition of him as a member of the herd. And I just want to make a point, like in Canada, we have human rights, and it's all with a collective requirement. You have to show that you're part of a group in order to get protection of the government. I have to be part of LGBT. I have to be part of the aged. I have to be part of the disenfranchised or the disabled. I have to be part of a religious group. And that's what happened during COVID. We had a case law that set out from Quebec that Canada would protect your religious beliefs, even if they differed from the religious faith group that you identified with. They would protect it. But during COVID, they said, that's all done. You have to have a collective requirement now. We're not going to protect your religious beliefs. If you're the only one in Canada that has them, you must provide us what your priest says or the Pope says or your GC in Washington says. And so that was that's why you could have in Canada, you could have letters from your pastor saying, I support their religious liberty. The Bible supports this, Adventism supports this. You could have, the president of the Canadian Union writing a letter of support. It did not matter because the collective requirement sought the highest authority, and it was that reaffirmation statement. It was very difficult to thread the needle then, and you just see all of this, you see all of it coming. And there's some other books, and I won't go into them. I'm going to let other people speak now, but there's something to be learned by the Russian economist Nikolai Kondratyev. He died for saying that there should be free markets, but he spoke about in 2020, 2021, he said that he did research with long waves in economic life, and he said all these waves of cycles converged in 2020, 2021, that because they were all converging, we would find ourselves in a deep dark depression economically and otherwise, because there are these 200-year waves and 40-year waves and 20-year waves, and he showed that they were all converging. Anyway, Joseph Stalin killed him because Kondratyev was saying we should have free markets, and Stalin wanted complete control of government. And another book that's very good is Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, and you'll see that we're following these tracks. These are the strategies were written out, and we're following the tracks. And another person who wrote was Zbigniew Brzezinski, Between Two Ages, Technotronic Era. He wrote out Ayn Rand wrote out in her Atlas Shrugged. They always write out what the strategy is, what the plan is. Somebody's always tasked with doing that. And these people like to say there's a conspiracy, but you can see that we're on track with all of these. 1967 report from Iron Mountain, the possibility and desirability of peace, which included incorporating slavery. We needed slavery back. Anyway, in some sense I'm digressing, and in some sense this is all comes together, everything's connected. And you're talking, Natalie, about the progression and how we got there. So, yeah.
Thank you, Grace. Dr. Tim Rumsey, you had your hand up.
Yeah, well, we're talking about World War I. We're covering a lot of other ground as well, but I'd like to summarize what I'm hearing and connect it with something the Bible talks about. And that is, this hasn't been said yet, but I think this is where the discussion is heading. War can be very useful to accomplish a specific objective, even though that objective may not be the public one that's stated. And so someone, we mentioned a moment ago, collective conscience, this herd mentality. What we're seeing here is an effort. How do you get people to willingly give up their freedom and their liberty? It's a difficult thing to do because that desire for liberty and freedom is something that we're all born with. No matter what our background is, no matter where we're from, we each have this innate desire for freedom and this sense of justice that if we're denied freedom, this is an injustice. So how do you move individual people? How do you move an entire society, or much less an entire global population, to the place where they're willing to give up the liberty and freedom in order to, achieve security and peace and whatever that may be? Now, I want to connect this with what we find in the Bible, because what we're really talking about here is the gradual but very deliberate moving of the globe, the world, humanity as a whole, into a very different mindset than what we find laid out for us in the Bible. When we talk about the gospel, it's the good news of salvation. And Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." And he says in another place in the Gospel of John, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So, a lot of people can have many different views about the Bible and Christianity, but when you really look at what Jesus himself said, he came to set us free and to give us freedom. And that freedom at a most fundamental level is on a personal basis, one-on-one. How do we know that? Some of Jesus's most important conversations happened with one person. You can think of his conversation with Nicodemus. That was a one-on-one conversation. John chapter 3. In the next chapter, John chapter 4, he has a one-on-one conversation with the woman at the well. She was not a Jew. He wasn't supposed to be talking to her, and yet here he is. And she was one of the very few people that Jesus clearly and explicitly told, "I am the Messiah." I just read one Bible verse, Hebrews chapter 9, verse 14, talking about the results for us individually of the sacrifice that Jesus has made for us. What does the blood of Christ do? This is Hebrews 9, verse 14. "How much more shall the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without spot to God, purge your conscience from dead works to serve the living God?" Here's the point. The Bible says that our conscience, there's only one person that has a right to that, and that is the one who died for us, Jesus Christ. Now, he'll never take control of that conscience by force, unlike the world and the world powers, but he's the only one that really has a right to that. So there is a battle going on in this world. It's a very old battle, but it is coming to a climax soon. And it's really over the human conscience. Who can give us freedom? Is it freedom that we find from our Creator and our Redeemer, as the Bible explains it, or is it a type of freedom that the world promises to give us, but what do we have to give in return for that? So that's kind of a biblical background for the things that we're discussing here. And, issues like World War I, there's lots of arms and legs to it. We can't possibly cover it all in one conversation here. But keep this in the background. Where are these things leading, and why are they being put in place? And what does it mean for me personally? Does it match with the biblical definition of freedom and liberty and what God wants for us, as he explains in the Bible? Or is the picture that we see emerging in the world in front of us right now, is it different than what the Bible lays out for us?
Thank you very much, Grace and Dr. Tim. I really appreciate those thoughts. I think those are excellent thoughts, especially dealing with the herd mentality. A question that I had after doing all this research on the social scientists was, what kind of mindset does it take to be an individual, to really stand up against the crowd and to make decisions that keep integrity to yourself as an individual? And I'd like to maybe go back to the presentation and talk a little bit about what happened really with the social scientists and with the thinking. So I'll go ahead and share my screen again. And there was a recipe that was really used. And as Grace was talking about this book from Bernays, there was a recipe by really somebody considered the grandfather of propaganda, and that was Gustave Le Bon. He was a medical doctor and he wrote tons of books, and one of his interests was propaganda. And he said there is an elite group of men and they are designed to rule, and let me give you the tools to rule. And some of those tools were, well, you could sum them up into 5 points, which is you want to use repetitive visual messaging. You want to use good guy versus bad guy thinking and communication. You want to simplify really complex arguments to one-liner core messaging, and you want to repeat that. You want to discredit opponents through smears and personal attacks, and you want to manipulate existing values that people have. Now, with regard to your question, Dr. Tim, or your point, your observation about messaging, I think that this is really critical for us to stop and analyze, especially if you find yourself in a polarizing view, which is, am I subject to messaging that is shaping my mind and shaping me as an individual? Am I subject to that? And I think it's really important to do a deep dive with yourself about that and to analyze what is forming your character and what type of information is forming your life, as it were, your life purpose and mission. Because what happened after this information came out, it affects the world today that we live in. Dr. Le Bon's information affected World War II. It affected the military. The military then did experiments and education based on this material, and they shaped a whole generation of people through propaganda tools that he called propaganda. And he basically said, individuals one-on-one are okay, but when you get people in a group, then they behave in some really crazy ways. For example, he was a Frenchman, but he very much disdained the French population because they had been involved in the French Revolution, which was madness. It was uncontrolled, wild craziness. And he said, the crowd is there to correct social action. So if you have a government that has gone haywire and corrupt, then a crowd will come on the scene and they will protest, they will mutiny, and they will cause a societal correction that will shift things either for good or for bad. And most of the time it's for bad. Well, the elites took this information, the elite leaders and American politicians and other thought leaders took this information from Gustave Le Bon, and they began to shape policy, as it were. And in fact, America's propaganda, which I will now explain or unfold to you, so shaped America, then it shaped the globe. It actually shaped Hitler and Goebbels' campaign. Goebbels was, I believe, chief informationalist for the World War II, and he studied these writings from Bernays. And he had his book in his library, and he said, Goebbels said it was a basis for his constructive campaign against Jews. Now, the irony about this information was that Bernays was a Jew himself, and he created this whole thought industry on how to influence, and was so effective at it that he taught Hitler and Goebbels how to kill the Jewish population. A Jew teaching Nazis how to kill Jews. Crazy. We also know that Hitler was influenced by propaganda studies from Britain and America based on chapter 4 and 10 of his book, Mein Kampf, when he discusses all of that information. So I want to talk about now something that happened. Oh, and it looks like somehow my heading disappeared. So let's see here. I guess I didn't pull that out. Anyway, so what happened? Woodrow Wilson got into office in the second term, and then he created he said, Americans are going to be outraged. We have to do something to keep America in the war. And JP Morgan, the House of Morgan people said, hey, we need our money back. And we've got to partner and work together to turn this whole country in favor of the war. So Woodrow Wilson appointed George Creel, who was a journalist and a campaign manager in his first term, to this committee called the Committee of Public Information, CPI, as it was known. And we're going to discuss now the men and the methods. What happened to turn America around to this new, to favor the war, and then to get involved with Wilson's 14-point plan that began to affect the United States and then the globe. So George Creel, Edward Bernays, the Secretary of War, Newton Baker, Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, and Secretary of the Navy, Josephus Daniels, all formed the Committee of Public Information, and they created a Bureau of Information to persuade the American people of how to think. And Secretary of State Robert Lansing was also responsible for committing America to offer credit to the Allied powers in Wilson's first term. This is a matter of public information. And so now we can see the American people were not privy to this. And then there was also a new thought that we should have a domestic and a foreign department of this gospel of Americanism, which is transporting American thinking and American globalism to the world. And this was like, and so these men set about by categorizing American people by age, race, occupation, and education so they could tailor advertising campaigns to each demographic level of society. And they spun this whole effort as information sharing, not censorship. And there would be a voluntary censorship agreement, which would be based on patriotism and honor. And so these men collected and controlled all war information. They created war information to the tune of 6,000 articles that were given to the press. The press was then to publish and disseminate all of them. And all of these articles were found to be factual with the exception of 4. And amongst the 4, the Associated Press, or the press in England, had printed information then was different than America. And there was a discrepancy, and this was noted by the American public. And so there were cases like this that popped up that was a discrepancy of information. But basically what happened was all of this information was collated into something that was called a Federal Register. This Federal Register then, it was collated into something called the Official Bulletin. And the Official Bulletin published this information. All the newspapers got the information and dispersed this. And then this Official Bulletin was the precursor to what we have today, called the Federal Register. And this Federal Register is responsible for disseminating all factual information for the United States. Now, I say all factual information because we know in hindsight that the Committee of Public Information created facts, statistics, and an entire narrative about the war that they wanted the American people to have. But today, the Federal Register is information about the government, and it's widely available to everyone. And and the official bulletin was considered a creative reporting disinformation bureau, or misinformation bureau. But the Federal Register today is, it's, how shall I say, it is more, I guess that's the document that offers the statistics and the news of each of the departments of the federal government. So even though the official bulletin was the precursor, there are two different functions. So the Committee of Public Relations was in charge of changing the mind of the American people. And how they did this was to create the 4-Minute Men, who were responsible for raising money for the war efforts through war bonds, if you could afford them, or war stamps, if you only had a few pennies to give to the government. The 4-Minute Men were men that were designated to stand in the movie theaters and give a 4-minute speech while movie reels were being replaced. And these speeches would be patriotic speeches to convince the American population to supply funds for the war and to sacrifice for the war. And there were 75,000 of these 4-Minute Men plus high schoolers. They went to every city and every town. They gave 755,000 speeches. This was enough for the entire US population 3 times over at that time. And there were 4 Liberty bonds and 1 Victory Campaign bond that was sold that raised $24 billion between 1917 and 1919 as a result of these 4-Minute Men that raised funds and awareness for war support efforts. At that same time, the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act made it illegal to oppose or criticize the government. There were all sorts of volunteer leagues. There was a group of 250,000 Americans that signed up. This group was sanctioned by the FBI to repress dissent and offer less confrontational transitions from individual liberties to state power. And all of this went on for the whole entire war until it came to an abrupt halt. Information got out, and the people found a discrepancy, and suddenly the American public was furious, and the whole affair was blamed onto George Creel. Creel was accused of misappropriating $6 million of government funds for misinformation. One day when he was out of office, some trucks came up, grabbed up all of his files and took them off to some place, and nobody ever found them again. And there was no information that was available about the Committee of Public Information other than to say George Creel was a misinformationalist. So basically, what happened was this idea after the World War that when you have individual liberties and state power, when individual liberties are higher than state power, then society flourishes. There's freedom and prosperity, peace and harmony, and innovation and growth. But when you have state power that is higher than individual liberties, then that is when tyranny ensues. And World War I was the perfect example of that happening, especially to those who were not a part of the war efforts. And some of those people were German people who had been in America, who had lived in America for generations, but then found themselves the objects of national scorn. Some of those people were conscientious objectors who said, hey, we don't believe in war, we don't believe in killing, it's wrong to kill. Some of those people were anti-war proponents who said the government is wrong, they're giving disinformation out, this whole world war is wrong, we're killing other people, we're involved in international intrigues that don't even pertain to us. So in the middle of this, unbeknownst to the American people, Woodrow Wilson had commissioned 150 social scientists to identify the world's problems and come up with this 14-point plan for world peace. And some of these points are, hey, when we have a war, let's have only open covenants of peace. Let's have no private understandings, no secrets. We're just going to be open and free. Diplomacy will always be done openly and in the public view. We're going to remove all economic barriers and have open trade. Everybody's going to reduce their war munitions to the lowest possible level. Free-minded people everywhere are going to pick their rulers. All of y'all with colonies, you're going to select your rulers, and there's going to be a general association with nations. They're going to come together. They're going to determine what's best. It's going to be kumbaya, and basically, whoever did not come on board with this was going to be deemed as people who want peace for themselves, but not peace for others. For example, Americans who said we should remain neutral, those people would have the peace of cowardice and the peace of selfishness. But the people who came together in this world association, those people would have the peace of brave men, of righteousness, and of justice. And so we see there is a lot of very religious talk that is being incorporated in with this American imperialism idea. So basically what happened is World War I ended, and a watered down version of this 14-point plan was accepted. And the League of Nations eventually formed. And you know who was a part of the League of Nations was some people from the Boer War back in 1898. Those guys who were on opposite factions were now part of the peace process. So one of the gentlemen who had fought against the British interests, he was viewed as a traitor, and now he was going to be on the same team at the same table as these British leaders advocating peace for a community when his own country had been raped and plundered pretty much by the British Empire. And so the League of Nations was starting off really rocky. Another weird thing that happened was Churchill was a reporter. He started out as a reporter for the World War I, and he was also reporting on the Boer War. And eventually, he worked himself into the First Lord of the Admiralty for Britain, and then he became an officer. Then he was demoted. Then he became Prime Minister. Eventually, he's part of this peace process. And this World War I, which was the war to end all wars, in fact, sowed the seeds for World War II, because as a condition of peace, Germany was told, hey, you guys have to accept all the responsibility for this war, and you've got to pay all this this remuneration back to everybody. You've got to pay for your damages for being so destructive. And basically, this League of Nations idea started the new World War II process with Wilson's 14-point plan. So I'd like to take a little minute here to talk about what military, we're kind of going to jump forward into the future. So what peace looks like, in fact, and we've got two ideas. First of all, peacekeeping realities. Peacekeeping looks like, let's see, peacekeeping looks like this. Peacekeeping by the United Nations, or the League of Nations then at that time, would be a role as a Department of Peace Operations and an instrument developed by the organization as a way to help countries torn by conflict to create the conditions for lasting peace. So peacekeeping is basically guided by three principles, which is the consent of parties, impartiality, and non-use of force except for self-defense and defense of the mandate. And finally, peacekeeping looks like robust mandates that the UN will use to deter all parties involved in the League of Nations or in the UN. Peacekeeping will be used to protect civilians and to keep people away from threat of physical attacks, or help national authorities to keep the peace in their nations. So peace is defined as, I guess, maintaining the order. But in fact, what does peace look like? Well, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute identified what the global budgets of the nations are that are involved in peacekeeping. And as you can see, there is an unprecedented rise in global and military expenditures in the world. And the number one nation who is spending the most by far on peacekeeping is the United States. And then we're followed by other nations. But what is interesting is the 9 nations below us, their sum total does not equal the US's total in keeping the peace. And what does this mean with regard to the League of Nations? Well, the US was supposed to join the League of Nations, but America was still new, and they said, we are not going to belong to the League of Nations. We're going to belong to this old order of staying out of other international fights, and we are going to maintain our neutrality. And yet the US started donating funds in spreading out to the world in peacekeeping budgets, as we will soon see. And then it also happened that the US started donating attention and time, or allocating budget to domestic policies as well. So basically, what I want to summarize at this point is George Washington had invited the United States to stay out of international debates and wars, and to keep the peace at home and abroad. And Wilson's plan was to leave the old order behind, shed the Declaration of Independence and shed the Constitution, and get into a new form of government that was a world community government. And as a result of this world community, the US eventually joined the League of Nations, and now we have a budget that far surpasses the globe, because we took on a kind of colonial overlord mindset that we have to police other nations, and we took on an expansionist vision. And let's see. I think I'll just share one more slide at this point. Let me stop sharing here, and then I'll open it up for discussion. Let's see. This next document that I want to share is a document contrasting George Washington's vision with the League of Nations, or the UN model vision. And this is the nature of the system. The United States government has a sovereign nation state as set up by our founding fathers. The United Nations model has an intergovernment organization of sovereign states. And because different nation states have different ideas of what it means to have a government, they all don't agree on what it means to have a government. They have to accept somebody else's idea of what government is. So there is an elite ruler over the global community as they sit down at the table. In the old model, we had the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution that informed the United States about how we would conduct government in our nation. But that was a very different very different vision than Wilson's 14 points, which eventually informed the League of Nations and the UN Charter. The League of Nations covenant basically says we are going to have peacekeeping for the entire globe. And the US model says we don't enforce peace on anybody else, we maintain ourselves. And our Constitution gives us binding authority. It articulates our morality as a nation and the legitimacy for our independence and our self-government. But this elite group of men, this Darwinian model of thinking, informs and defines the legal process for the globe. And in the source of authority for the old George Washington's model, that confers inalienable rights upon everyone. The Declaration of Independence says there is a supreme creator, and he is the one who gives us rights to govern ourselves. We then give our power to the government to secure these rights for us. We want them to secure liberties and tranquil enjoyment in the rights of person and in the rights of property. And any kind of alterations we need to make as a group, those are alterations that are made as an amendment to the Constitution in a public process. In Wilson's plan of rulership, there is a Darwinian science of rulership. As I said, there's a selected group of men who are at the top, who are racially and intellectually fit, and they decide what's best for everyone. In George Washington's model, we're fully sovereign. We boss ourselves around, we dictate to ourselves, but in the League of Nations and United Nations model, there are members and non-members that are subject to peacekeeping activities in the defense of what the UN thinks is best, what their vision is for world peace. And in citizenship, the individual US citizens are created equal, and we believe we have rights and life and liberty, rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as Dr. Tim was talking about earlier. But the thing is our document says all men receive this. We believe that these rights are conferred upon humanity as a whole, not just US citizens. And so if we have this agreement with ourselves, then we should operate in a way that we are treating others in this very same way, whether they are citizens or not. But in the UN model or the League of Nations model, there are only those who meet membership requirements. Only they are the ones who receive these benefits. And I did say this was my last slide, but I'm remembering that I have one more thing to share. And the thing that I would like to share is, how do I know these things about what the UN is or what the UN does not? There was an incident that happened in the 60s where the UN got involved in peacekeeping with Congo's first prime minister, this gentleman here named Lumumba. And what happened was Congo was colonized by Belgium, and Belgium decided to give them their independence. I don't think Belgium thought that they would really be independent. And so the King of Belgium came over and he said to the Congolese, hey, I'm giving you your independence. Here you go. By the way, y'all are really miserable and we don't like you, and this is what we've done for you. And the prime minister was so incensed by this that he gave a very stern public reminder to the king: you have oppressed us, you have raped and pillaged our nation, and we don't want you in our country anymore. Leave. And in fact, all the Belgian people left immediately, and the infrastructure for Congo disappeared overnight, instantaneously, and there was immediate chaos. Patrice Lumumba called the UN for help, and he said, there's chaos here, please come help. And so the UN arrived and they set up some infrastructure, but they did not help. They closed the airports. They prevented money from flowing from Patrice Lumumba. And the member states, which included Belgium and America, united together to assassinate Patrice Lumumba. Patrice had said that he did not want to have the country's natural resources sold to to enrich these colonizing powers anymore. He said our natural resources should belong to us. And the CIA felt that that was a threat. So they bribed his chief of staff, who then kidnapped him. And a Belgium troops, I believe, under the orders of the CIA, then tortured and assassinated Lumumba. The chief of staff, whose name was Mobutu, became the leader for Congo, and then he ruled for the next 32 years, I believe, and enriched himself to the tune of $4 billion at that time from the Congolese people, left the money in shambles, and that is why Congo is the way it is today. But that is an example of UN peace treaty or peacekeeping solutions that is offered to the world under Wilson's 14-point plan. And I think I will just conclude there.
Okay, let me bring everyone back up, and so that we can have just a brief summary of this. Okay, so that, all right, thank you so much. Last week when we had kind of gone through a run of this and we had talked about this, it was a little different. As Natalie had said, we were really interested in this subject because we first started out thinking about how to let people know that when you're watching the news, when you're watching these videos, when you're trying to figure out what is happening, like with Charlie Kirk and with some of these other current events, what is actually happening, that we have to keep in mind that there may be there might be some intentionality as to how the public, how you and my mind might be being shaped, and how we are going to understand these events. When I was a kid and I learned about what was happening in other countries as far as how they were learning history, I was finding out that in some countries they didn't understand history the way that I did. And I thought, oh, these poor people, they don't know really what's happening in the world. They're just responding to the propaganda from their government. Thank goodness that I live in a country where we don't do that. And the older that I get, the more that I learn, I'm realizing that as long as there are people in the world who don't know Jesus, that we are all at risk of doing that to each other, trying to shape reality for other people, unless we are converted people and have humility and are seeking for truth. Because unless I am willing to accept this truth into my own life and to die to self, I am at risk of doing that to somebody else. And so if we understand that there has been this controversy going on between good and evil, we see Cain and Abel. As soon as Abel told Cain that he would be true to God in worship, and that's the only thing that he wanted to do, he was killed. And so we see that the way that Satan works, he works to force his mindset upon other people, at the risk of the loss of their lives. And so you see that happening from the very beginning. You see that, the Tower of Babel, this was a movement that started as a rebellion against God. And so Babylon is a government structure that has been set up from antiquity to help in bringing as many people to a mindset that they will not be able to accept the true God. And so this desire by people to have power in the world. You see it in Babylon, Medo-Persia, you see it in Greece and Rome, this desire for dominion, for one world government, for a new world order. And Satan has been perfecting his MO all throughout history. And now what we are seeing is that it is all coming out in the open. And Satan is he is he is making his way very clear and open. We're just seeing it more and more clearly. I think that what Natalie, what you and what everybody here has been describing, we're just able to take the mask off of what Satan has been doing. And so I hope that what we are learning today about what happened with World War I, we are seeing that this was a point at which the American people, and people should understand, maybe if you aren't familiar with Bible prophecy and the role that the United States has played in Bible prophecy, you can go to Pathway to Paradise, Tim Rumsey's YouTube channel. You can learn a lot more. He shares a lot about where the United States falls in Bible prophecy, shares more about that. But we are really interested in people understanding how these specific points in history are not just coincidence. And it's not just, oh, this is how this happened. World War I played out this way, and then this is how World War II happened. There has been intentionality from the very beginning of time. And so I think you can see, what Natalie has shown with George Washington and the founding fathers with the Constitution, what their intention was so that tyranny would not be able to take place in the United States. And then with Woodrow Wilson, you see that with his 14 points of peace, this was a break from the whole ideology of the founding fathers. There's actually a website that shows that Woodrow Wilson did not believe in the precepts of the Constitution, actually, and wanted to make a break with it. And then you'll see how that caused the United States then to get into World War I during a time when a propaganda machine was coming on the scene, and people's minds were being shaped so that they would start thinking differently. I think this is the point at which we are, where we see that our minds now, we've had a long time. We've had, I think, what is it, over 100 years for our minds to be shaped so that we will think a lot differently than the founding fathers about what our role is here on this earth and what the United States role is as a group of people, and then my role as an individual and how I view government, how I view the role of government and the individual and God and liberty. And I think another thing that was important was understanding the impact of evolution and evolutionary thinking upon our view of uh, the sanctity of life, um, racism, things that, I think that people who are atheists want us to view a certain way. And now the tables are being turned. And those of us who would believe in a faith-based ideology are considered to be, I think, racist and intolerant and this type of thing. It's just really interesting how this is all coming together. But at the my thing that I would want people to leave with is that there's nothing new under the sun, that our minds are being shaped, that there are a lot of things. This world is a stage. A lot of the things that we are seeing are psyops that are intentional for our emotions to play into things so that we will be manipulated to move in a certain direction. And it is very possible that Christian nationalism, that the climate control, climate change, that our health demics that are happening, that the political stages with Charlie Kirk and all of these things, a lot of these things, there it's possible that there is intentionality to how this is all playing out for people. Somebody else want to comment on this?
Well, we're talking about war and conflict in general and how it can be used to direct people to think and then act a certain way. The Bible actually records for us the very first war that ever happened. It's recorded in Revelation chapter 12, and it's just very interesting. In verse 7, it says, "There was war in heaven." And the Greek word used that's translated as war is polemos, from which we get the word polemics. And, at some point, that battle in heaven became physical because the Bible says that Satan and his angels were cast out of heaven. But it seems that for much of that conflict, it was more in a conflict and war of ideas and words, which is exactly what we're talking about here. Philosophers of war will tell us that we're now in fifth generation warfare, which is the propaganda. We've advanced from sticks and clubs to bows and arrows to rifles to tanks to airplanes, and now it's psychological warfare, the most advanced kind of warfare that we humans have arrived at. And yet this is how warfare started in heaven. So what's the point? Well, the Bible says that we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers and the spiritual forces of evil in this world. It's Ephesians chapter 6. So I would just encourage, everyone watching this, listening to this, to keep in mind that the things that we see on the surface, as disturbing and frustrating as they may be, no matter which angle we're looking at it from, according to the Bible, there are much more significant issues underneath the surface of that current. And those unseen issues are the real forces that are driving what is happening, and that some people hope will drive each one of us into a specific way of thinking and a mindset. And it's really only as we allow Jesus Christ, we looked at that verse earlier from Hebrews chapter 9, as we allow him to have control of our mind and to, guide us in our thinking, and certainly as we have light of Bible prophecy. It's really our only hope, according to the Bible, of making the right decisions in the issues that are coming on our world and which are here right now. So I encourage all of us, as well as those who are watching, look to the Bible for answers. It reveals a tremendous amount of information that will help us very practically in our life right now. Respond to the things that are happening and make the right decisions for things that are still on the plane coming toward us.
Thank you. In a letter dated August 15, 1875, Albert Pike, who the Canadian connection to that is Albert Pike was born in Peterborough, Ontario, which is like 2 hours west of me. And he went down to the southern United States, and he was involved in the military in the Civil War. And then he stayed there. He learned a lot from First Nations, and he stayed connecting First Nations with government. Anyway, he wrote a letter, August 15th, 1871, setting out plans for world war conquest by 3 wars to usher in the New World Order. The goals for each of those world wars were World War I, to enable communism to destroy Tsarism in Russia. World War II, fascist versus political Zionists, Germany versus Britain, basically. And then post-war communism will be in a position to take over governments and weakened religions worldwide in the establishment of the State of Israel. Most of that was accomplished. And World War III sets out political Zionists versus the leaders of the Muslim world, Judaism versus Islam, to destroy each other, bring the entire world into a battle, create chaos, and finally to prepare the way for the New World Order. And there's then a new religion. And whether or not that letter really existed, that's for other people to make up their mind. But Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States in 1831, and he traveled the country, and then he wrote 2 volumes, which were published in 1835 and 1840. So I didn't have that information earlier. But we are, all of this is coming to a point that is extremely important, and we can see a building up of community consensus, community consciousness, community agreement to moving back to government controlling conscience. Just what Pastor Tim was talking about, and Natalie, Davy, and Joyce. And what happened when Alexis de Tocqueville went to the United States was this was 30 years before the Civil War. And he said he talked to a lot of clergy, and they said, we're not interested in being part of politics. They thought that was a very bad idea, and they would never do it, and because there needed to be a separation between politics and religion. Well, that changed by 1888, of course. And in 1892, you had an act of the legislature that said, in violation of the Constitution, we're going to close the World's Fair in Chicago every Sunday for 6 months. But what he wrote in here was that some very important things. And he said, I know that apart from influence proper to itself, religion can at times rely on the artificial strength of laws and the support of the material powers that direct society. There have been religions intimately linked to earthly governments, dominating men's souls both by terror and by faith. But when a religion makes such an alliance, I'm not afraid to say that it makes the same mistake as any man might. It sacrifices the future for the present, and by gaining a power to which it has no claim, it risks its legitimate authority. And to a greater degree, all the things that have been described are the reaching out of man for an authority that doesn't belong to him, and we risk our own legitimacy. And as we look to the coming years, and especially next year, where we have a focus on government linking itself with religion, I am afraid that is exactly what is going to happen. Alexis de Tocqueville says, therefore, by allying itself with any political power, religion increases its strength over some, but forfeits the hope of reigning over all. And he talks about how when religion connects itself in any political alliance, it has to, he says, his words are better than mine. Hence, any alliance with any political power whatsoever is bound to be burdensome for religion. It does not need their support in order to live, and in serving them, it may die, because it has to ally itself with the. When government seems so strong and laws so stable, men do not see the danger that religion may run by allying itself with power. And I think it deserves a whole other presentation. And I know that Jay Cameron has talked about separation of church and state, but I just see all of these ideas coming together, and the history paving this pathway to a very different world than what we've come from, one in which takes us back to the Dark Ages, one in which there is so much corruption, oppression, slavery, legislation of conscience. And but here we are in a global scale. We've never been here before. I think Davy made a point like that, and so I can't say it any better than probably Alexis de Tocqueville could say it. But I think this is what we're looking at, really.
Thank you. Davy, did you have something that you wanted to add before we close?
Uh, well, I think everyone did a good job contributing to the what became a pretty big conversation, both historically and biblically. I just think in World War One and everything that happened in World War One, we really see, especially in the aftermath of it, and in even everything that involved with it, like when, I think Natalie was touching on how Woodrow Wilson was elected on, oh, he didn't get us in the war, and then like months later, he immediately jumped headlong into the war. You see how it's just a shines a headlight on the nature of politics and the things politicians are willing to say and the character of modern politicians.
Mm,
And after World War One, Satan really used this to like it. World War One was a direct cause of the Spanish flu. A lot of people don't know that the Spanish flu was directly contributed by troop movements and massive global spread. The World War One, the aftermath of it led to women's liberation. The modern feminist movement, women's suffrage, all these movements came directly out of World War One because all the men died. Pretty much all the men died, and the women were kind of running the factories and running a lot of the stuff. And they said, hey, well, we've been running the show here back at home, so we should have the right to vote. We should have the right to be just like a man. We should be able to have the same purchasing power and the same rights and abilities and the same voice in politics and business. And you get the women's rights and feminist movement coming out of World War One. You get this kind of expat culture, this kind of multicultural idea where like people like nationalism really started to die. It flared up with especially the fascist states in World War II. But a lot of the idea of national sentiment kind of died. People got really tired of the idea of patriotism. Now it's like patriotism in the West is like, except for like a contingent of like right-wing conservative people, it's almost entirely dead. People don't really believe in that the way they did, but you really see that at the end of World War One with this expat culture. People started, going to other countries and living in other countries en masse. And you didn't see that before. Like people are like, no, I'm a German, and not even I'm a German, but I'm from Dusseldorf or I'm from wherever. And people had really strong connections to their town and where they lived, and their identity is like, oh, I'm from Guadalajara, I'm from Dusseldorf, I'm from Marseille, I'm from wherever, and people really were attached to like where they lived and their country. And that kind of dissolved. And people were like, oh, well, what does it even mean anymore? And people started moving all over the world, and it kind of changed the culture and the way people thought about themselves and what a nation was and what nationalism meant and what women's place in the world was, and the rise of national pandemics. And then it paved the way for cultural revolutions with communism and all these things. So you really see how Satan really used World War One to foment the modern world, and it kind of planted the seeds for all of the modern uh, cultural and political, economic, health calamities that we're still dealing with to this day that have only exacerbated. And you really see the beginnings of all that happen in World War One. Especially with Woodrow Wilson. And Woodrow Wilson also kind of, he was involved with the creation of the Federal Reserve, right? And the modern monetary policy that exists today, this kind of debt society, that really started during this time. So a lot of people sleep on this time and don't really understand or know anything about this period, because Hitler kind of steals the show, when it comes to the world wars, because the World War II is basically the Hitler show. It's basically just, Hitler is the main character and everyone else is just kind of a side piece. Where World War
yeah.
One, if you actually look at it, you see the seeds of the modern world being planted. It wasn't in World War II, it was in World War One. World War II was just the reaction to it and the inevitable conclusion of that. And so I think all that's really interesting, and it's worth knowing, because the more you understand it, the better you can see how Satan's using those things and is just perpetuating the same things today with all of the different psychological operations, all the different wars, the cultural phenomenons. It's all the same stuff. It's all just the culmination of a thread that was established a long time ago.
Well, I really appreciate that. I really appreciate all of your contributions to this discussion. And I hope that it has been illuminating for other people. You know, as we're thinking about how history repeats, how there's nothing new under the sun, how there's a great controversy that is going on for the souls of mankind. You know, this is the most important thing that we want to focus on, is that there is a great controversy going on for each one of us. And, you know, whether or not you believe in God, whether or not you believe in the Bible as it is written or this kind of thing, these questions are very important. And, you know, it's not just Christians who believe that something's about to change. There's so many people that are talking about how what we are going into right now is a totally different time. I was looking at Redacted. They were doing a program on how they think that this is extinction level, what is about to happen. And so, you know, uh, there are a lot of different versions about what is about to happen. And, you know, I know that some people think that there's going to be a time of glory for the church. And some people think, like, I've heard people who believe in the New Age think that we are going to go through a difficult time, but then things are going to get much better. And we who believe in the Bible believe that according to the Bible, things are going to get very bad before Jesus comes. And that most people living on this earth, just as in the time of Noah's Ark, will have access, will be able to be warned by a messenger. We believe that Noah warned this earth for 120 years before Jesus came, but that most people chose not to get on the ark. I think that there were people who believed Noah, especially after they saw the animals get on the ark. But I think that because most of their friends didn't get on, most of their families didn't get on, that there were a lot of people who just didn't have the courage to do something different. And so for those of you who are watching, not really sure what to make of things, uh, if there's any part of your heart that thinks that there might be truth to the Bible or truth to God loving you, maybe truth to what we're talking about here, I hope that you will have the courage to move forward, to do something that you've never done before, and to read the Word of God, to pray, to ask the Lord to show you what is truth. And he will reveal himself to you. He says, if you seek for me with all your heart, you will find me and you will know truth. So, Dr. Tim Rumsey, could you close us off with a word of prayer then? And you're muted. You're muted. Unmute.
Certainly. Father in heaven, thank you for the opportunity to discuss these things, and pray once again as we finish that you will lead each person here who is watching and listening into truth. Ultimately, truth is a person, according to the Bible, and that person is Jesus Christ. And so, how do we know truth? We have to have a relationship with that person. And the good news is the Bible says that you want to have a relationship with us. So I pray that you will reveal yourself to each person here, Lord, and that you would reveal truth to us that we may truly understand your purpose and your plan for our lives and the issues before us so that we can make wise decisions. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Amen. So for those of you who are watching, if you could subscribe, hit the subscribe button. If you could share this video, if it's been a blessing, like it, and just let your friends know about it. And Dr. Tim Rumsey's YouTube channel is Pathway to Paradise, and he has a lot of really relevant talks about the image of the beast, the United Nations, and Bible prophecy, and this type of thing. So I'd highly encourage you to go there, Pathway to Paradise. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Natalie, for this presentation. Thank you, Grace and Davy, Dr. Tim, and hope to see you again. We're going to be here again next week for another episode of Our Beloved Church. Thanks. God bless.